It's not up. No, we took it off share screen. He's getting excited.
Okay. Can you stay a little bit later?
Should be.
What?
I should be able to stay like tomorrow.
Yeah. Like. Are you recording now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you waiting for Larry? Do you have Larry? Do we have Larry?
It says that Larry is here.
Yeah.
But I don't know if he's listening.
Right.
That's who we're waiting.
Is he set up to go? I mean, we're doing Larry and then me, or me and then Larry?
If you're ready, you can go before Larry.
Okay, we can do that.
All right.
Well, your conclusion was certainly well-founded. I'm very impressed with the thoroughness of the research you've been doing. Let me give you a comprehensive overview. The official story we have been given, of course, was that 3 shots were fired by a lone demented gunman by the name of Lee Oswald from the 6th floor of the book depository, scoring 2 hits with 1 miss. In fact, we've been given a video that's supposed to substantiate that. This is, in particular, the Zapruder film. Let's take a look at what we have here. It's only 26 seconds long. If we're lucky, it'll actually play for us.
Mm-hmm.
If not, it appears that JFK was in fact hit at least 4 times. He was hit once in the throat from in front, once in the back from behind, and twice in the head from behind and from in front. The shots to the throat and to his right temple appear to have been fired from above ground sewer openings on the north and south sides of the triple underpass. Actually, we've refined that and discovered the shot to the throat was actually fired from inside the triple underpass. It's very important in scientific research that you satisfy the requirement known as that of total evidence. That scientific reasoning must be based upon all of the available relevant evidence. Conclusions are only justified by true premises, which means that it's indispensable that we must sort out the authentic from the inauthentic evidence. And we're dealing here with the most complex murder mystery in history. Now, it's indispensable to understand that the Secret Service set him up. Two Secret Service agents who would have accompanied the limousine were left behind at Love Field by Emery Roberts, the agent in charge of the Presidential Protection Detail. Here, one of them, Henry Rebka, expresses dismay at being called off. The motorcycle escort was cut down to 4 who were instructed not to ride forward of the rear wheels. One of the officers observed it was the damnedest formation he'd ever seen. JFK's military aide, who normally would have sat between the driver and the agent in charge in the front seat, was moved to the last vehicle along with the president's personal physician. There are more than 15 indications of Secret Service complicity in setting him up for the hit. In addition to the agents left behind at Love Field, the manhole covers were not welded, open windows were not covered, and the crowd was allowed to spill into the street. Notice here an absolutely stunning photograph where the presidential limousine is beside a bus. An assassin with a handgun could easily have shot JFK under these circumstances. And look at the enormous crowd spilling out into the street. This is completely in violation of every protocol known to the Secret Service, was part of setting him up. Governor Connolly was instrumental in making a change to the motorcade route on November 18th, 4 days before the event. Normally, a motorcade route, once fixed, is never changed, so the Secret Service can check every building and screen its occupants. This change brought the president past the Texas School Book Depository. In other words, they created a new scenario, a new route to bring the president into the kill zone, where they had the alleged assassin located and situated to play the role of patsy. Most tellingly, the vehicles were in an improper sequence. The presidential limousine was placed first. Lower-ranking dignitaries, such as the mayor and the vice president, should have preceded him. Reporters were moved to the rear, and the president's personal physician to the last car would put him in the worst location should the patient require emergency medical treatment. At Parkland Hospital, where the moribund president was taken, a Secret Service agent took a bucket and sponge and began cleaning the brains and blood from the limousine. When onlookers noticed a through-and-through hole in the windshield, the vehicle was moved. Here you can see on the left, by Monday, November 25th, the day of the formal state funeral, the vehicle had been sent back to Ford to be completely stripped down to metal and rebuilt, including replacing the windshield, which had a bullet hole, the black spot at the center of the small white spiral nebula, which you can see on the left. The Secret Service would produce a third different windshield with cracks in its face to misrepresent the original, meaning when it was sent back to Ford, they removed and destroyed the windshield with a through-and-through bullet hole. They imposed a brand new clean windshield, and yet a third windshield with spider cracks would be produced by the Secret Service. Here you can actually see in frame 225 where the bullet hit the windshield. During a press conference at 3:15 p.m., Malcolm Perry, MD, standing on the right, who had performed a tracheostomy through a small wound in the president's throat, explained 3 times that the wound was a wound of entry. A transcript of this event would not be provided to the Warren Commission, but would be published in my first collection of expert studies, Assassination Science, in 1998. Charles Crenshaw, MD, was present during the efforts to revive JFK at Parkland, drew these diagrams of the appearance of the throat wound before and after the tracheostomy incision, which is consistent with Dr. Perry's description of it as the wound of entry. Just a small, clean puncture wound on the left, and then a simple straight line incision through the wound is seen on the right. Jackie's testimony to the Warren Commission about JFK's head wound was not published on grounds of respecting his privacy, but in fact, it would have blown apart the official commission report. Here is what Jackie told them. I was trying to hold his hair on. From the front, there was nothing. I suppose there must have been, but from the back, you could see, you were trying to hold his hair on and his skull on. I can see a piece of his skull sort of wedge-shaped like that, and I remember it was flesh-colored with a little ridges at the top. This was a skull bone that was blown open when he was hit with a frangible or exploding bullet. We have here in this photograph, by the way, evidence of the alteration to the body, because notice how the wound to the throat has been greatly exaggerated. In fact, Commander Humes, in charge of the autopsy, reached out to Bob Livingston, who was the scientific director of the two of the National Institutes of Health located across the street, who was an expert on wound ballistics, and asked him what it would look like if it were a wound of exit instead of a wound of entry. Bob described, and Humes used that description to change it, that Jack's eyes are open here is indicative that this does not, in fact, appear to be the body of JFK, because Charles Crenshaw, the last physician to observe the body when he was wrapped in sheets and put into the bronze ceremonial casket, closed the eyelids. And in fact, we have done a study that shows this is not the body of JFK. There was no magic bullet. Officially, one shot hit the president in the back of his neck, passed through his neck without hitting any bony structures, and entered the body of the back of Governor John Connally, inflicting multiple wounds. It shattered a rib, exited his chest, damaged his right wrist, and entered his left thigh. Since this trajectory is so implausible, the alleged missile virtually pristine, it has come to be known as the magic bullet. Here's a representation in the book by Gerald Posner, Case Closed, where he doesn't even have the entry at the base of the back of the neck, but lower down, which actually coincides to where Jack was hit in the back. But once you understand how far down he was hit in the back, it's no longer plausible to imagine it came out his neck. Nevertheless, this is the official trajectory according to the Warren report. Here you see the jacket he was wearing, which shows a hole about 5.5 inches below the collar, which contradicts the official location of the wound. If the bullet entered here, especially at a downward angle, it's difficult to imagine how it could have passed through his neck and exited at his throat. A bullet hole in the shirt turns out also to be about 5.5 inches below the collar, too low to correspond to the official location at the base of the back of the neck. Neither the shirt nor the jacket were sent forward to Bethesda for the autopsy, a violation of autopsy protocol. David W. Mantic, the leading expert on the medical evidence in the world, went to Bethesda. He's been there 10 times. Had one of the staff members put on the shirt and the jacket and discovered the hole in the shirt is ever so slightly lower than the hole in the jacket, indicating he was hit at a downward angle. The Bethesda autopsy was conducted by James Humes, who was assisted by J. Thornton Boswell. Neither had ever performed an autopsy on a gunshot victim before. Boswell's diagram of the wound shows a wound to the back about 5.5 inches below the collar. Here, using my cursor, I pointed out right there on the back. And here, in the verified version by the president's personal physician, Admiral George Berkeley, you can see again, there's a wound on the back diagrammed by Boswell, where later it would be shifted upward to the base of the back of the neck to justify or support the magic bullet theory. One of 2 FBI agents who witnessed the autopsy, James Siebert, drew a diagram showing the relative location of the wounds, where the back wound is lower than the throat, making it most unlikely they were connected by a shot that had been fired from above and behind. Admiral Berkeley composed a death certificate on JFK, which said he had been struck in the head by one shot and that a second wound occurred at the posterior back at about the level of the 3rd thoracic vertebrae. He added that the head wound involved evisceration of the right hemisphere of the brain. He had lost about half his brain in Dealey Plaza. Well, it turns out that the 3rd thoracic vertebrae is about 5.5 inches below the collar to the right of the spinal column. Some apologists for the official account suggest his jacket was bunched up, which made the hole lower than the wound, but that would not explain the diagrams of the wound showing it at the same location on the body itself and corresponding with the shirt and the jacket. Even the Warren Commission staff concluded the back shot had been at that location, as this reenactment photograph displays. The The large circular patch on the back of the stand-in's jacket represents the back wound. The smaller, the official entry wound to the head. Notice a discrepancy. Here you have Arlen Specter, then junior counsel to the Warren Commission, using a pointer to exhibit the path the magic bullet would have had to have taken in order for the account for all the wounds with only 2 shots. It's a larger circular patch visible below his left hand indicates the back shot. A photo intended to illustrate the theory actually refutes it. Here we have evidence that, in fact, the bullet that hit Jack in the back actually passed through the back of the limousine, the back seat of the limousine, and caused damage to the leather. Interestingly, an early document released by the Assassination Records Review Board showed that Gerald Ford, then a commission member, had had the back wound re-described from his upper roast back, already an exaggeration, to the base of the back of his neck in an effort to make the magic bullet hypothesis appear more plausible. David W. Mantic, indeed, who is board certified in radiation oncology, however, took a CAT scan of a patient with chest and neck dimensions similar to those of JFK. When he plotted the official trajectory, it turned out to be anatomically impossible. Cervical vertebrae intervened. Notice you cannot have a bullet enter here at the base and pass through the neck and exit here at the throat without hitting cervical vertebrae, which means it's not even an anatomically possible trajectory. The most stunning proof Oswald wasn't even a shooter. We have him arrested wearing this long sleeve, richly textured shirt that's rather worn and frayed at the bottom, as you can see. When he was photographed, however, they had him remove the shirt because they were already aware that he'd been captured standing in front of the book depository in a famous photograph, but wearing the long sleeve shirt. So to conceal the similarity, they had him remove his shirt. Here you see the backyard photographs that were used to frame him in the mind of the public. Oswald was shown a photograph like this, there are 4, and said correctly that it was his face pasted on someone else's body. Notice how they tried to tie together the Mannlicher Carcano with which he's alleged to have shot the president, the revolver with which he's alleged to have shot Officer J.D. Tippit, and holding 2 Communist Party newspapers supposed to have been his motivation. Larry Rivera has proven that the stand-in, the body double for Lee Oswald, was in fact an officer for the Dallas police tied to the CIA by the name of Roscoe White. Jack White showed that these different photographs taken with a handheld camera should have had discrepancies, differences in the face, but yet Oswald's face is exactly the same, which is proof by itself that they were photoshopped, they were manufactured. Jack White used the known dimensions of the Russian newspapers as an internal ruler and measured it off against the man standing in the backyard, and found using that ruler he was only 5'6" when Lee was 5'10", or in some reports 5'11". In other words, he would have been too short to have been Lee Oswald, or alternatively, what indeed was the case, when they introduced the newspapers, they put them in just a bit too large. Here we find what's known as a mat that was discovered in the office of a Dallas Police Department lieutenant who said he was only trying to figure out whether it could be done, but in fact you'd need this in order to fake the photographs. The principal reason the framing of Oswald was so poorly done is it was left to the responsibility of the Dallas police on the assumption that he would know Dallas better and could more readily frame him. Here we have a segment from this most famous photograph taken by the AP photographer James Ike Alchix. You'll see this in the area there. There's a figure extending out where Lee Oswald himself said when he was asked by Will Fritz where he was, that he was standing with Bill Shelley in front. And indeed, when you do a close-up, you see several figures that have been run together. The figure here actually is Lee Oswald. The figure here is a face that was obfuscated that I originally thought might have been Oswald until I we did further research on this. This is Billy Lovelady wearing a black and red checkered shirt to make him look like this man. But when Billy was photographed, the blunder was committed because the man standing out they wanted to make him look like has a pocket on his shirt. The shirt Billy was photographed in has no pocket. This was part of an elaborate scam to make it appear as though it was Billy Lovelady in the book depository doorway rather than Lee. In fact, they were both there. Lee is here. Billy is here with his hands raised. His face has been blacked out. He himself said he thought it was odd they would be confused because he was 2 to 3 inches shorter than Lee. Notice he's 2 to 3 inches shorter here, 15 to 20 pounds heavier, probably a lot more. And in fact, he was actually wearing a short sleeve red and white vertically striped shirt, very different than the long sleeve richly textured shirt Lee was wearing. So here you see a comparison in how similar the man in the doorway is to Lee Oswald when he was arrested. This is the shirt that Billy was actually wearing that day. The FBI asked him to come in on the 29th of February, 1964, wearing the shirt he'd worn that day. It was a short sleeve red and white vertically striped shirt. So we actually had Billy ask during the Warren Commission to identify his location with a black arrow, but they had it painted here in black on black. So while Billy's actual arrow was to himself, they had another arrow pointing toward Lee, as though Billy had identified himself as this figure when Billy was in fact identifying himself as that. Indeed, we have a lot of research here on Billy Lovelady, a study of Jekyll and Hyde, this by Richard Hook, where he noticed that this man that they attempted to portray as Billy Lovelady has a completely different profile. In fact, it's so odd, I described this guy as Gorilla Man. Billy had a much different profile. This guy is quite large, even insignificant to Billy, and would be about twice the physical dimensions of Lee Oswald, but that's what they sought to do. Here's a comparison between Billy in the wrong shirt with Lee in his shirt. This is an effort they made to try to make them look the same. Judith Baker, Very Baker, who was Lee's girlfriend in New Orleans before the assassination, did a pixelization study of their left sleeve. She compared this left sleeve with this left sleeve, since officially the government claims this is Billy, even though he was in fact wearing a short sleeve red and white shirt that had no long sleeves. When she did that, she discovered that the comparison of the Alchin 6 with the Oswald sleeve was very, very similar. The comparison of the Alchin 6 with the Lovelady sleeve wasn't similar at all. The differences were quite gross, meaning very substantial. Here is a Richard Hook estimate of how they created the face of Oswald, he thought, by altering certain features. It turns out Richard's conjecture here has been superseded by research by Larry Rivera that shows that apart from the messing with the hairline, this actually is the face of Lee Oswald and not that of Billy Lovelady. This, however, a reconstruction by Richard, I think, is right-headed about how they created a figure in the background known as Black Tie Man, so that the man in the doorway actually is missing his left shoulder, and how they blacked out the face of Billy Lovelady and obfuscated a figure which I originally thought was Bill Shelley, but which Larry has identified otherwise in his brilliant work. Just to show you how far-reaching was the CIA, they took obscure newspapers. This is a News Palladium, and it had an original first edition, President Kennedy killed by sniper, with no photograph. Then to try to make it appear as though the Alchins had been available earlier than it was the following day, they actually did a special edition of the News Palladium as though this had been the original. There was only one extra edition, but they substituted a fake version for the original. Ralph Sinkay was responsible for this discovery. Meanwhile, the body was altered. The x-rays were fabricated. Dr. Crenshaw drew the blowout to the back of the head, which he described as the size of a baseball or of your fist when you double it up. During an interview broadcast on television, he also described an entry wound at the right temple consistent with the mortician's description. So if you take your face and double it up and put it to your back of your head, that's where this blowout occurred. Remarkably, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations reinvestigated the case in 1977-78, its medical panel concluded the entry wound was actually 4 inches above the entry location previously specified, which had been identified by that smaller patch in the stand-in in the staff reconstruction. It was depicted in diagrams on the right, but not visible in photographs on the left. In other words, they simply made it up. Here's that skull patch to which Jackie referred that was blown open. I hear Larry in the background. I'm very glad he's joining us. On Saturday afternoon, a medical student named Billy Harper found a fragment of a skull opposite the grassy knoll. He took it to his uncle who photographed it. David Manting has reconstructed where it went and found the Harper fragment here on the left fits in at the very back in that blowout to the back of the head. Here's another diagram of the head wound by Robert McClellan, who was also present at Parkland. Blowout that fits Dr. Crenshaw's description. According to the autopsy report, however, the fatal shot entered at the back of his head and blew out the top of the skull. The Navy artist who was instructed to prepare these sketches was not allowed to observe the body and when he here we have some frames from the Zapruder film, which have been show evidence of the blowout here and moving forward and then backed out the back of the head. Sometimes referred to as the blob that moves around. Consistency between the next film and the Zapruder. In the next film, on the back of the trunk and Jackie further back. Even if Clint actually cut Jackie, the films do not show him pushing her back into the seat, which is what he's maintained for 40, at the time, 47 years, now over 50. In his formal report dated 30 November 1963 about the events of 22 November, a copy of which is archived on my blog at Assassination Science, he reports, as I lay over the top of the back seat, I noticed a portion of the president's head on the right rear side was missing, and he was bleeding profusely. Part of his brain was gone. I saw part of his skull with hair on it, which is consistent with frame 374, we'll see, but not with frames 313 through 316, where I discovered that while they patched the back of the blowout at the back of the head in the early frames, they'd overlooked that it's actually visible in later frames, especially 374. Remarkably enough, when they published a book about the Secret Service in Dallas entitled The Kennedy Detail 2010, it included this sentence: and slumped across the seat, President Kennedy lay unmoving, a bloody, gaping fist-sized hole clearly visible in the back of his head. Notice that contradicts the Warren Commission conclusion that he was shot from behind, because that was obviously an exit wound fired from in front. In fact, we always had witness after witness reporting the blowout at the back of the head. Some 40 witnesses from Dealey Plaza, from Parkland, from Bethesda, including bystanders, physicians, medical technicians, agents of the FBI, reported JFK had a massive blowout to the back of the head, a location of which they demonstrated with their hands. David Manning, who entered the Bethesda Naval Hospital to study the x-rays in December of 1962 for the first time, told me he thought he would find evidence that they had altered the x-rays, but also of a second shot to the head. He had noticed this area here at the back of the head had way too much contrast to be a real x-ray. And that, in fact, when he performed optical densitometry studies, he discovered this area here, referred to as area P for patch, had been covered over using a material far too dense to be human bone. Here we have frames 374 and 375, where it turns out that you can actually see the blowout. Jack here, you can see the blowout at the back of the head. Larry has found additional evidence of the blowout in other frames. When I did a close-up, it was my suspicion those who were involved in reconstructing the whole movies, including the Zapruder, might have overlooked frames flash 313, 316 that displayed the wound to the back of the head. I found this image of the blowout in frame 374. And you see that pinkish extension Jackie was talking about in the diagrams from the HSC-8. That's a bone flap that was blown open when he was hit with this frangible exploding bullet. But here's a blowout. Remember, you see brains described as gray matter. It's bluish gray. Here's a frame 317. We can see fairly clearly how they had blacked out the blowout at the back of the head and moved part of that material to the right to make it look as though there was a blowout in the right front instead of at the back of the head. Here's a comparison between frames with a blacked out blowout and where you can actually see the blowout. So it becomes extremely clear that the Zapruder film itself is not even internally coherent. Here's Larry's brilliant work. He discovered that Jackie's glove actually highlights the defect to the back of the head, that his head ought to have covered this whole area, but it's all missing, which Jackie's glove coincidentally surreptitiously highlighted. So you got Jackie's right hand down here, her left hand there, but the missing part of JFK's head is clearly visible. Here, Larry has diagrammed that missing part of the skull. Here, again, you can see the missing part of the skull. It turns out that we had physician after physician who described the gaping hole at the back of the head and the extruding cerebral and cerebellar tissue coming out from it. Well, the cerebellum is a compact part of the brain at the base. So if you had cerebellar as well as cerebral tissue, that meant the back of his skull was massively blown out, as we know to have been the case. But where the diagrams and photographs of the brain in the National Archives, it shows a completely intact cerebellum and not missing that half of the brain that was even described by Admiral Berkeley in his death certificate. So that Robert B. Livingston, MD, a world authority on the human brain and an expert on wound ballistics, studied the reports of cerebral and cerebellar damage from Parkland. He concluded the brain in the diagrams and photographs at the National Archives cannot possibly be of the brain of JFK. David also discovered evidence of a second shot to the head, but this distribution of metallic particles. This is the shot that actually entered in the vicinity of the right temple and blew that blowout in the back of his head. Here we have the mortician who prepared the body for burial, telling an investigator that in addition to a large gaping hole in the back of the head, there was a small wound in the right temple and a wound on the back 5 to 6 inches below the shoulder to the right of the spinal column. He actually describes the crescent-shaped skull flap that was blown open. Interestingly, he talked about small shrapnel wounds in the face that he had to pack with wax because that bullet had passed through the windshield. Some tiny shards of glass had punctured JFK's face. It was David Manning who figured that out. It's remarkable that he observed no swelling or discoloration to the face, meaning that JFK died instantly in Dealey Plaza. Here's a comparison between the stunning difference of the wound as it appeared at Parkland and those many witnesses, how they enlarged the wound. Actually, Commander Humes took a cranial saw to the skull to enlarge the wound, but it's described in mathematical detail in the official Bethesda autopsy report, and then how the House Select Committee, astonishingly enough, tried to shrank the whole wound, so it's not even consistent with the Bethesda autopsy report. I called Cyril Wecht, who was on the medical panel, to ask Cyril, how did the HSCA account for the massive discrepancy between the huge blowout described in the official autopsy report and the small wound described in their report? Cyril, to my eternal disappointment, told me he'd have to check his notes. Additional proof that the home movies were fixed. Here we have many eyewitnesses, dozens and dozens about the limo stop. One is Tony Foster, who was interviewed by Deborah Conway in 2000. She seemed to have no idea. Her recollections contradict the official record. Tony told Deborah for some reason the car stopped. It didn't stop for seconds. I don't even know why it stopped. All of a sudden it sped up and they went under the underpass. I could never figure out why it stopped. Others, Billy Lovelady on the steps. I recall that following the shooting, I ran toward the spot where President Kennedy's car had stopped. Roy Truly. I saw the president's car swerve to the left and stop somewhere down in this area. Mr. Bellin trying to distract him. When you saw the president's car seem to stop, how long did it appear to stop? Mr. Truly, it would be hard to say over a second or two, something like that I didn't see. I just saw it stop. I don't know. I didn't see it start up. Based upon Larry's reconstruction of all the activities that took place during the stop, my estimate is actually the car stop lasted as long as 20 seconds. Mrs. Earl Campbell, this is the wife of the mayor. I was aware that the motorcade stopped dead still. There was no question about that. Later, as I told you, the motorcade was stopped later. Mr. Hubert, was that when your car at least had come to a standstill? Mrs. Campbell, every car in the motorcade had come to a standstill. Later, we were dead stopped for a matter of some seconds. Here you have Noel Twyman in his brilliant book of the Bloody Treason asked Noel Roderick Ryan, who is an expert in cinematography, why the background was blurred in 302, the foreground shot but the background blurred, but not blurred here. And Ryan explained that that's because the camera was following the vehicle in motion here, but that the vehicle had stopped here. He added that he'd shown it to his son, who's also in the film industry, and he agreed it was moving in 302, but not moving, stationary in 303. Erwin Schwartz observed brain matter blown out to the left rear. An associate of Abraham Zapruder, who is purported to have taken the movie, viewed the film in what appears to have been its original state at Eastman Kodak, where it was developed. Nearly 60 witnesses have reported the limo slowed dramatically or came to a complete halt, as Vince Palamater explained in a chapter in Murder in Dealey Plaza, which was my second compilation of expert studies of the assassination. When Noel asked him about the limo stop, he was vague and could not recall, but when Noel asked him about the effects of the fatal headshot, Schwartz was quite specific and very graphic. He said he'd seen Kennedy's head suddenly whip around to the left. He'd seen an explosion of blood and brains from the head, and it was blown out to the left and rear. Twyman pressed him on the point, but he was emphatic. His account can be found in Bloody Treason, blown out to the left or rear. If, for example, William Greer, the driver, had shot JFK, since Greer was to Jack's left front, if Greer had turned around to shoot JFK, his brains would have been blown out to the right rear, looking at the limo from behind. But instead they were blown out to the left rear. The first frames from the Zapruder to which the public had access were published in Live. Most were unremarkable, but this one, frame 313, posed special problems. The plate was broken twice to revise description 6. And I'm talking about the printing plate. Every issue of the magazine came off of one set of plates, every single issue. So they actually stopped the process to revise the description and broke the plate. Then they started printing again, but they were dissatisfied. They stopped and broke it a second time. This is unprecedented in the history of publishing. There are many indications this and other films have been edited to include the all but motionless spectators. The driver's head turns twice as fast as humanly possible, and the blob and blood spray, which appears to have been painted in. So you hear this blood spray. But as John Costello discovered in his brilliant tutorial about the editing of the Zapruder film, this was painted in. It dissipates almost immediately, which would have been impossible had it been real. Blood and brains across the trunk, and the driver's pointing to the left and bringing the vehicle to a halt had to be removed because they were such obvious indications of Secret Service complicity in setting up JFK for the hit. Secret Service agents even reported being nauseated by seeing the blood and brains on the trunk, but it's all been cleaned up in the Zapruder film. Further confirmation of the blowout to the left rear comes from Secret Service agents such as Sam Kinney and Vincent Gullo Jr. Vincent Palomara, who's a leading expert on the Secret Service, wrote to Gullo to explain that Kinney had told him of his discovery of a piece of the right rear of the president's skull in the limousine during the flight back to Washington, D.C., and that another member of the detail had become nauseated from observing the blood and gore on the limousine trunk. Gullo confirmed Kennedy's statement to Palmara, saying he was totally familiar with the facts as Palmara had outlined them. During a promo, a book tour about the Kennedy detail, Clint Hill explained, as he has explained for 50 years, how he rushed up to the back to push Jackie down and then lying across the body witnessed that fist-sized blowout to the back of the head, which description of which even made its way into the book. So this is astonishing testimony from the first man to observe the wound that contradicts the official report of the Warren Commission. When you compare the Nix and the Zapruder, as I was mentioning before, Jackie goes further back in the Nix on the left and Clint Hill further forward versus the Zapruder on the right. So those films are mutually inconsistent. We also have the superposition of Zapruder frame 312. Between 312 and 313, we have forward motion, which is all that remains of the shot to Jack to the head after the limousine driver, William Greer, pulled the limo to a halt. He was hit in the back of the head. He slumped forward. He was wearing this firm corset to assist him because of back injuries he'd sustained in World War II, PT 109. Jackie's him back up, and that's when he was hit in the right temple by the frangible exploding bullet. But they had to take that out. So they took all the frames other than one that remained from 312 to 313 and then took out too many frames. So we have a violent back into the left when Jack simply slumped to the left. Here we have, this is from Josiah Thompson's book, a very scientific analysis, where you see the frames here moving forward. You see the frames 301, 310, 12. From 12 to 13, it's going forward, then back and to the left in the subsequent frames confirming it. Josiah Thompson sought to disavow this, the most important contribution he ever made to scientific research, approaching the 50th observance in 2013, because he was working for the other side and wanted to destroy evidence of conspiracy. So as I mentioned before, Jack appears to have been hit 4 times. David now believes there may have been a 5th, another shot to the head, once in the throat from in front, once from the back from behind, and twice in the head from behind and from in front, where the shot to his throat we now believe was fired from inside the triple underpass, the shot to the right temple from the above ground sewer opening at the intersection of the triple underpass and the picket fence. So the actual shooting sequence looked like this. He was hit in the back by a shot fired from the top of the county records building by a Dallas deputy sheriff. Then he was hit in the throat by a shot fired from inside the triple underpass that actually passed through the windshield. That's this purple line moved forward further to the left. Then after the driver brought the limousine to the left and to a halt, he was hit in the back of the head, 1 of 3 shots fired from the Dow Tex, one of which missed and injured the distant bystander, another of which missed and hit the chrome strip above the limousine windshield. Then, after the limousine was further down, although there was an attempted shot from the grassy knoll by that same police officer, Roscoe White, who was the stand-in for the backyard photographs, he was hit in the right temple, a shot fired here by Frank Sturgis, who may have been the best shot in the world at the time. Another shot that missed was fired from the top of the county records building. Then several, as many as 3 shots were fired from the book depository by Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman at John Connally in the mistaken belief it was Ralph Yarborough. Lyndon had a huge fight with JFK that morning, seeking to get Yarborough into the vehicle with JFK because he hated Yarborough, and Connally, who'd been his campaign manager and was a crony out, but JFK overrode them on the ground that the chief executive of the state ought to ride with the chief executive of the United States, obscuring the politics. There's brilliant work on the editing of the film by Douglas P. Horn in his 5-part series, Inside the Assassination Records Review Board. We also have a summary of all the different alternative theories where, when you take into account the way in which the body was appropriated, the films were altered, the x-rays were changed, It had to be powerful government sources involving elements of the U.S. military, naval officers at Bethesda, the Secret Service. So it turns out when you put all the pieces together, you have to distinguish between the sponsors, the facilitators, and the mechanics. The mechanics were the actual shooters on the ground, their coordinators and supervisors, who included, believe it or not, George Herbert Walker Bush, but also Edward Lansdale. The facilitators who made it happen, Lyndon Johnson of the assassination, J. Edgar Hoover of the cover-up, were the sponsors, the individuals and groups who wanted to jack out, primarily to replace his policies with those of Lyndon Johnson, included the CIA, the Joint Chiefs, the anti-Castro Cubans, the mafia, the powerful elements surrounding the Fed, the Texas oilmen, and Israel. Here you see Edward Lansdale walking past the three tramps. This was Charles Harrelson, the father of the actor Woody. This is Charles Rogers, known as Richard Montoya, with the third tramp who's obfuscated here was Chauncey Marvin Holt, who actually prepared 15 sets of fake Secret Service credentials for use in and around Dealey Plaza. I was, I believe, the first to identify George Herbert Walker Bush in this photograph standing in front of the book depository. It's clearly him. We have that photograph of Lansdale and another of Lansdale waiting to speak to Bush because they were the guys on the ground. Among the books you must consult to get the full story, Bloody Treason by Noel Twyman, who pointed out that the most perfect combination with the greatest probability of success entailed a combination of the CIA military, the Secret Service, the Mafia, LBJ, and Hoover, where Lyndon was the key player in bringing those elements together. The best book on LBJ's role as mastermind is by Phil Nelson. Another excellent book, The Man Who Killed Kennedy, The Case Against LBJ by Roger Stone, recently in the news as an associate of Donald Trump, who's been, framed for the Russia hoax when there was no Russia hoax. If you want the straight skinny on that, you can see the new book by Greg Jarrett entitled The Russia Hoax, or go to my blog at jamesfetzer.org, where you'll find a blog entitled The Russia Hoax Comes Apart at the Seams. Here's my fourth book about the assassination, JFK, Who, How, and Why, solving the world's greatest murder mystery, which includes some of the brilliant research of Larry Rivera, who now has his own book at Moonrock Books. Here's the picture that tells it all. This was on the back of Craig Zerbel's book, the Texas Connection, LBJ with Lyndon Johnson, who would betray him to become president of the United States. It's a fascinating, sordid story. I'm so glad to have had the opportunity to be with you here today.
We have a question, Dr. Fetzer. You talked about Superintendent Truly. And Superintendent Truly, when I believe it's May Barber, the gentleman who was born 1920, dies in 2011, and when he's the police officer, motorcycle officer that runs into the Texas School Book Depository, have you done much research on him?
No, but Larry can probably answer your question very well. Larry knows the detailed bios of virtually everyone in Dealey Plaza, certainly those who were participants. So I
think he may be gone, but he had to pick the...
Oh, there he is.
There he is. Go ahead, Larry.
Hey, what was the question?
Yeah, I was looking at some interest with, especially considering your work in this area, but if you look at the testimony of the police officer that ran into the building, he changes his testimony about 4 times. Originally, he says he talked to Oswald in the doorway, which would affirm what you were saying in the picture. Then he says he talked to Oswald in the lunchroom, but he never went into the lunchroom until he said he was outside the door. But when you stand outside the door, you could not see into the lunchroom, so that was kind of a false deal. Then he changes to say he was on the stairway between the 3rd and 4th floor, and he goes back to the one at the Warren Commission. He goes back to the idea that says he was back in the lunchroom, which obviously he couldn't have talked to Oswald, but he could have talked to Oswald in the doorway, which explains why Oswald was, like you said in the picture, and he could escape really quickly because he was already outside the first place.
Well, the timing of Marion Baker is much later. Okay, than what happens in the doorway at the time of the assassination. Marion Baker was actually way towards the back of the motorcade with the press buses.
Right.
And and he was actually placed back there by Stavis Ellis because apparently he wasn't. They really couldn't trust him. They thought that he wasn't that smart. He wasn't. They sort of like they wanted to keep him, away from the president. And so by the time he drove around, actually a couple of minutes had already gone by. Maybe about a minute and a half or something like that. He is seen in one of the films, I believe the Crouch film, where he's dismounting his motorcycle and crossing the service drive there of Elm Street to go into the depository. So the timing is different there. By the time he gets up there, he actually went up there was a stairway there adjacent to the entrance, and then he would have to go across the second floor all the way to the back where the lunchrooms were. So
right.
that's if you look at the diagram of the building. Okay.
No, the way I was saying is that because in that one picture they show somebody that looks to be like the old lady had gone from the doorway to the front. Truly has gone from the doorway over to the side. Baker comes running through. But it would all make some sense, especially if he's changing the story, if this does happen, and if Oswald hadn't really moved, if it's just like a minute or whatever it is, then
if all the figures in the doorway that are captured in the Alton 6 have already moved by the time that Baker goes up the stairs there.
Right, but if he wouldn't have had enough time to get into the second floor, what he had?
Who, Baker?
No, I'm talking about Baker. Would Oswald had not been able to go from the ground floor to the second floor at that time?
Yeah, he would have after he could have gone back into the building, which appears to have to be what happened. And some people, for example, there's a researcher in Sweden, Stefan Westerberg, who even doubts that the lunch encounter ever happened.
Yeah.
Okay, and he's written a paper on that, so a lot of things that have come out, in recent years having to be reevaluated, such as what Jim is talking about, the stoppage of the limousine based on the interviews of Fred Newcomb with the motorcycle cops, and what's happened with the Zapruder film, the proof of alteration, and of course what's going on in the doorway with the modern imaging and overlays that with which we've been able to prove that it's Lee Oswald in the doorway. So we're always evolving with theories and patching up this giant puzzle. And now with the new documents, we've also been able to find a lot of the missing pieces, and everything keeps evolving, like I said.
You want to see some of Larry's overlays?
Yes, go ahead. Yes, I sure do.
Yeah, because he has verified, really made the matter beyond any reasonable doubt as to Lee's location, as to Roscoe White being the body double in the backyard photographs, and a host of other extremely striking and significant findings.
And all that is based on new technology, Jim, which is now available. Let me do a screen share here. And we can go right here.
Unfortunately, we're only going to have about 10 more minutes of time left. So
that's going to work fine, Mike.
Okay, good.
I hope this works. Okay, this is a 9-panel overlay, which I think I've shown these before, but these still are relevant today because nobody has yet been able to come and refute these As I have explained before, the level of opacity goes from 0% down to about 50% or 60% with the overlays. And this is Billy Lovelady trying to match him to doorman. And as you can see, the features don't line up. The shadow of the nose doesn't line up. The lips, the chin, the brow, even the nose extends in a completely different direction. This is a animated GIF for animation of that previous collage. And it shows the technique here is the less movement that you see, the better match of the probe, the control photograph, and the gallery image, which is the one that we're testing. Sure. And as you can see, there's a lot of movement. Whereas when you look at the other, when you look at the Oswald,
Billy Lovelady was not the doorman. And when you see how Lee fits hand in glove, you'll understand.
Right. And this is with a grid and ruler where you can actually take empirical measurements, we can draw empirical data and actually measure the features. And then this is another gallery image that was used. This one was taken from another photograph of Billy Lovelady, where they actually tried to pose him and purse the lips and everything. And what happened is that they made him even look ridiculous when you tried to overlay him onto Doorway Man. Obviously, at the time that this picture was taken, I believe this was 1971. No, this was 1971, I believe. They were trying to pose him, in the stairs there at the entrance of the depository building, and try to make him look as much as Doorway Man as possible. They did not.
Show us the Lee overlays, Larry.
Yeah, that's coming now. And as you can see, the ear, when the size of the head is not the same, the ear here doesn't even reach the required length here, the length here, the measurement here rather, where this is the ear of Doorway Man. And in this case, once you set interpupillary distance here, okay, then the rest of the features should line up, but they don't. And that's what these forensic overlays are all about. Interpupillary distance, okay, and once those are set, then everything else should fall into place, but they don't. And that's the animation. And this is these are just observations that I just talked about. The nose, the displacement of the shadow of the nose.
Larry, we're so short on time. We know it wasn't Billy. Show us that it was Lee.
Yeah, and that's why we're going to go. And this is the same thing here with Lee. As you can see, as you go from left to right, top to bottom, the features line up perfectly. The eyes, the nose, the brow ridge, the chin, the lips, okay? And as you go to higher opacity, you can see that is the case here. And this is a grid and ruler where, again, you can see the ear reaches exactly the desired length. The eyes match perfectly, the brow ridge. One of the key issues that I have explained to everybody listening to this is that the shadow of the nose is in perfect position relative to the nose itself, okay? And then these are the key identifiers, okay? And these are comparisons. The photogrammetry is where you can do side-by-side comparisons, run a line, in this case a red line, and you can see that there's a great deal of difference between the two individuals. Billy Lovelady and Lee Oswald. And then these are side-by-side animations where, you can just look at them.
This is the most important, Mike, because you can see Lee on the left fits and that Billy Lovelady on the right does not.
Yeah, and we have another one coming up here with the other photograph, which is even more dramatic. Okay. You got that? So, and then this is another image. And this is finally the Lee image, a bigger version of it.
Yeah.
And if we have a little bit of time, I can explain to you where Billy Lovelady was at the time. We have Black Hole Man here, and it was part of the Algen 6 photograph. Here's a close-up. And if you can see here, the inset here where I'm pointing, there are features here that are visible. The lips, the nose, the laugh lines, which are called perioral creases, and you can actually make out, features here. And there are enough. There are enough features where we can line up and also use the same technique, okay, that we use to identify doorway man. And when we use frontal shots, or that known frontal shots, photographs of Billy Lovelady, and we do the same operation, the same experiment in opacity, left to right, top to bottom, you can see that the features line up perfectly. The lips, the nose, the laugh lines. There's an even better photograph. This is an animation of that. This is that same photograph that Lee was talking about, the FBI photo shoot of 29 February 1964. Okay, and again, there's no movement here as the overlay progresses. Okay, and that gives us a positive match. When we do photogrammetry and we draw lines across and vertically, you can see that everything lines up and matches perfectly with the individual to the right. And then when we use the other photograph of Billy Lovelady, and we do the same thing here, in this case, we've got 16 panel overlays going left to right, top to bottom, increasing in opacity. And you have the same effect. There is no movement whatsoever. And when you do the at 50% opacity, you can see that all the features line up perfectly. And when we do the GIF, the animation, again, the key here is that you're not seeing any movement as you look at the features just one after the other. The nose, even right here, the eye here, you can see that there's no movement whatsoever in the lips, the nose, the distance, the lip, upper lip, distance between the nose and the upper lip is perfectly matched to Billy Lovelady. So yes, Billy Lovelady was in the doorway. That is correct, but he was not doorway man. And in the end, and when we do our a reenactment of that, this is what we have, and this is what the Alchin's photograph actually looked like that day. Okay.
Before it was altered, except of course, Black Tie Man had to be introduced since it's anatomically impossible to have someone both in front and behind at the same time. Mike, what Larry's work has done is definitively established that Lee was in the doorway, which means he not only cannot have been the lone demented gunman, he cannot have been one of the shooters.
Right. And it blows apart everything they had tried to set up, the whole thing.
Absolutely. 100%.
Well, that's very good. This has been very, not only entertaining, but it's been very informative. I had the opportunity to go to the Sixth Floor Museum last December. And I actually surreptitiously took a picture from the alleged sniper's nest looking down. And if anybody else ever take a look, if you were just going to shoot from that sniper's nest, you would shoot down Houston Street. You'd shoot
right.
Elm Street and anything else. So, I mean, that would pretty much take out a lot of the stuff, too. It's really weird that people just don't take this more seriously.
Yeah, I got to go. Thank you, thank you everybody, for the opportunity.
Thank you. I'm going to cut this around, and I'll send it to you, okay?
Okay.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mike. Bye-bye.
Bye. Hey, Jim?
Yes.
I'm thinking the more I've been looking at this deal for not Barbara Baker. I call Barbara because the running back used to play for the Gophers, I guess. But that might actually be something to compare the two, because it truly, they show in one of those films, one of the two films that was in the very back, shows Lovelady walking away from the front door. Then he said he was walking towards to see what happened. Truly was in front of him. Barbara comes running past him. Then he goes after Barbara and Baker, and they go into the inside the Texas School Book Depository. Well, he changes his. The guy is allegedly supposed to be a little bit on the. Let me take this off. I don't want to record this part.